Joining me, as you can see on the screen, is Ames Grawert. He's a senior counsel in the justice program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Ames, thank you for being here and for this report that we're going to be talking about that you and I think it's two other co-authors are putting out. The name of the report is Poverty and Mass Incarceration in New York, an Agenda for Change. And so to walk people through, let's take through the report, let's take the three big areas that you highlight in order. So the first area, the first bucket, as I like to call it, is decrease the number of people entering New York's criminal justice system. Talk more about that and how would New York State go about that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, for being a part of this conversation. It's an honor to be here. If you look back at the history of New York State, I think a lot of us, especially those of us who spent time living in the city, we like to think of the state as a progressive leader and change and making a difference on various issues. And that's true to an extent, but there are a lot of areas where the city and state actually lag and where we really need to pursue some proactive reforms to even catch up with some other states in the union. So if you consider the history of New York State, you can see, just like the rest of the country, starting in the 70s and 80s, our prison population began to grow by leaps and bounds. That's begun to taper off, but it's still very far above where it used to be in terms of just sheer size and per capita. So we think about a couple ways to approach this problem, and the first is, as you noted, is to simply reduce the number of people who interact with the criminal justice system or have any need to at all in the first place. That's doubly important because in research we released this past September, we showed that even a criminal conviction can have a serious effect on someone's long-term earning potential. We know, and I think it's fairly intuitive, that a serious criminal conviction like a felony can mean a long-term impact on someone's life course. And I think we know also intuitively that prison can have an even more serious impact. But our finding was that even relatively minor involvement, conviction of misdemeanor, can have a serious long-term impact too. So to bring back around to your question, we think about, number one, reducing the number of people who have to interact with the system at all. We identified two major policy levers for doing that. One is something that's actually very much on the agenda these days, and actually it seems to be something that will happen in some shape or form, which is very encouraging, and that's legalizing and regulating marijuana. This almost happened last year if you followed state politics. I think a compromise on it was only averted by the imposition of the coronavirus pandemic. But we know from just the sheer numbers tell the story that marijuana convictions, policing related to marijuana arrests have been a huge gateway into the New York criminal justice system and a huge contributor to racial disparities. So simply closing that door and choosing to address drug issues through a different lens, be it public health or non-criminal, can have a serious effect on reducing the number of people who have to interact with a police officer, have to appear in a criminal court, have to deal with a misdemeanor or a felony record for the rest of their lives. That's huge, and I think that's it's common sense and something that's been talked about. Another one that we've begun thinking about, and I think there's some really promising models for how to do this, but it's sort of a bit of a wonky solution. The idea is that if you become a suspect in a lower level offense, like a misdemeanor such as shoplifting or something like that, or potentially even a lower level felony, rather than even being charged with a crime, the case goes to a prosecutor, and the prosecutor can say, "I'll make you a deal. If you do these two things," and they can be like taking part in a community service program or some other thing along those lines. If you do these two things and complete them, I'll dismiss the charge. The charge is never filed. The record disappears. Your record will never even reflect that you were charged with an offense. That's really, really important. It will decrease the number of people who have any sort of interaction with the justice system and avoid some of those long-term harms that we identify.
So back to something you said earlier in terms of the earning potential of people who find their way into the criminal justice system, actually not earning potential, how much they lose as a result. And one of the findings you have, you write, even a misdemeanor conviction reduces earnings by 16%. But more to the point of what you were talking about in terms of the deal, being made between a judge and a defendant to divert them from prison time. As we were talking before coming on, when I was at the Daily News on the editorial board, I remember going over to Brooklyn to witness with my own eyes this new innovation from the late 90s of a community court, a drug court. Mm-hmm. And so is what you're saying is that that sort of pre-arraignment, those sorts of diversion programs that have now been around for almost 30 years, that they haven't gone to scale in New York State? And that's one of the things you're pushing the state to do, is to take the good ideas that have been at work in New York City and expand them throughout the entire state?
Yes, that's broadly right. So it's interesting. Drug courts seem to have caught on. Most counties in New York have a sort of drug court, and there are very valid concerns about how you administer a drug court, and
sure,
it can be done with great care, and I want to acknowledge those too. But the city's really led in some really interesting initiatives. The sort of pre-arraignment diversion program I mentioned is one that's been pioneered by New York City prosecutors and New York City nonprofits. The model I'm thinking of is called Project Reset. The Brooklyn DA, the Manhattan DA, the Bronx DA, the city prosecutors have really helped bring this program to scale, and it's helped a lot of people, several thousand already in just a few years of operation. But there are two, that's the good news. There are two sorts of bad news sides to that story. Number one is, at least the last time I checked, and this is a rapidly changing situation, so things may have changed, funding for a lot of those initiatives fell through as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And that's really upsetting. Like, these are programs that, cutting these sorts of programs, I think, is penny wise, pound foolish. Their cost is sort of, it's not nominal, but it's not trivial, but it's not huge either in city budget terms. But the consequences it can avert for people, I think, are huge. So you're investing a little money now to save, communities, and especially lower income communities of color, a lot down the line. So part of what we're saying is, number one, keep those programs safe from cuts. And number two, let's see if they can be adopted across the state as well.
Mm-hmm. And so this first bucket, again, was decrease the number of people entering the criminal justice system. The second bucket has to do with folks who, weren't able to be diverted but are now in the system. And that second bucket is reevaluate excessive sentences. One of those is streamlining parole. Talk more about that.
Yes, that's hugely important, and I think it's a major opportunity for the state legislature this session. As you may know, in many cases, if you receive a prison sentence, the sentence is denominated something like 3 to 5 years. After 3 years, you become eligible for parole, and parole would mean you are released from prison and serve the remainder of your sentence under supervision. It's a good way to cut, long prison sentences, because it means you're not serving the maximum time that a judge could have imposed on you. The problem is, parole is not granted as commonly as you'd think, or as fairly as you'd think, and parole is not administered as efficiently as you'd think either. One of the really egregious things that we identified, and we've been talking with a lot of advocates around the state about this, I think it's a really important issue and finally getting some well-deserved attention, is technical violations of parole. If you're on parole, there are a number of reasons you can be sent back to prison. One of them is committing a new crime. But another one is violating some condition of your parole, like missing a meeting with your parole officer, failing a drug test, something like that. And under the current system, it's rather easy to wind up back in jail all of a sudden, and ultimately back in prison. And what that does is we, aside from the obvious hardship, we know, and we talk about in our report, how difficult it is to return to your community, to your home, to the workforce from prison. Any sort of impediment you put in that process is going to have just cascading effects. So the problem with the way these technical violations are administered is they're another hurdle that people can trip on during the reentry process and make it that much harder. We think that's a contributing factor to some of the long-term impact of prison that we identify. And it's also just a simple way to reduce over-incarceration. And it's even a money-saving issue too. If you look at the sheer data on this, the state spends hundreds of millions of dollars reincarcerating people for technical violations every year. It's the right thing to do, and it's actually a way for the state to trim correctional expenses and help community.
Ames, talk about the Less is More Act. Is this legislation that is languishing in the state legislature or has yet to be introduced? What's the status of it?
That's a great question. So there's some good news there. It actually passed out of a legislative committee rather recently, and there was some interest in these sort of reforms last year, but I think it's really sort of catalyzed this year. There's a lot of interest in it from a bipartisan group of advocates, state prosecutors as well. I believe it was the Albany district attorney came out in favor of the Less is More Act last year. I was recently on a panel alongside some coalition partners at New Yorkers United for Justice with the Brooklyn DA, Eric Gonzalez. And we were all speaking in support of the Less is More Act. There's a huge coalition around it. Sort of the question is, New York finds itself in a real dire situation when it comes to the budget and negotiating an on-time budget that deals with very serious deficit or shortfalls due to the coronavirus pandemic. So the question is both whether there's a will to see this passed this session and whether it can be passed early in the session to have a real impact. I think basically there's momentum growing for it at a bipartisan level, including some actors you might not expect to be supportive, like district attorneys. But there are still some hurdles to jump over. I'm confident they can be jumped, but I don't want to count any chickens before they're hatched. I think it's really important.
You also have in the report, reform New York's sentencing structure to decrease baseline sentences and a bunch of other things. Walk us through that.
Yes, definitely. So a couple of years ago, my colleague, Lauren Burke-Eisen, she's the director of the Justice Program at the Brennan Center. She and a number of my other colleagues wrote a report called How Many Americans Are Unnecessarily Incarcerated that examined sort of exactly what you might expect. And the report concluded that if you sort of reevaluate the way we sentence people from a evidence-driven perspective, it would be very easy to shorten baseline sentences by around 25% without compromising public safety values. At the national level, that would mean hundreds of thousands of people who would, if that reform were enacted tomorrow and made retroactive, hundreds of thousands of people would benefit from that very quickly. So we're proposing taking up that reform in New York. I was a prosecutor for 4 years. I know how labyrinthine the New York State sentencing structure is. It wouldn't be an easy bill to write, but I do think it's an important bill, and I think it's an important idea that's worth pursuing.
The third bucket, and that is, so you've been through the criminal justice system, and now you are out. And once you're out, the problems or the obstacles and the hurdles sometimes even become even greater. So the third bucket is help formerly incarcerated individuals succeed in their communities. Specifically, how so?
Yes, this is a subject that I think is really important because I think our report very naturally points to the need to not just help people avoid the harms we identify in the report, the long-term economic costs of having spent time in prison, but also ameliorate those costs for people who are already experiencing them. I think that's extremely important. So one reform this is another one that I think is both important and getting some traction, is sealing and expungement. The idea is that if a criminal record casts a long-term shadow over your career prospects and over your life, over your ability to find housing, the solution is rather simple. Get rid of the criminal record. So the idea is after a certain period of time, after you've completed your sentence, a criminal record becomes either sealed, which means that the number of people who can have access to the record and know it exists is limited, or the record is expunged, meaning it simply no longer exists except for law enforcement purposes. And the ideal here is we want people to be able to legally deny it. So we want someone who committed a shoplifting offense when they were 18 to when they're 30 and an employer asks, have you ever been convicted of a crime? We want them to be able to say, no, I haven't. That's the sort of goal of these sealing and expungement reforms. There's a broad coalition forming around it called Clean Slate New York. The idea is to not just provide an avenue for people to have records sealed, because that sort of does already exist in New York to a very limited extent, but to make that sealing automatic. So you don't have to be someone who can afford to have a lawyer to bring a sealing application for you. That if you might not have the resources to figure out that sealing is available to you, you can still benefit from it. I think that's extremely important. So sealing and expungement, number one. Number two, we talk about providing education in prisons as well. If we believe, or our research shows that it's not just stigma that casts a shadow over someone's long-term earning potential after they've been in prison. The experience of prison itself is dehumanizing. It has profound social and health impacts on people. One way to limit those effects and make prison a better place and give people a chance to start working toward life after release is prison education. New York actually benefits from a really strong network of prison education providers who provide post-secondary, like college education for people who are incarcerated. There are a few limits to that, though. People who are in prison are not eligible for some grants under state law. So we propose sweeping those limitations away and giving people a chance to apply for state funding to support college in prison.
As you were speaking, I was wondering, okay, so now we've gone through all three buckets. And so now we've got to talk about some of the constituents here in order to make what's in the report reality. For chief among them, well, it's sort of a chicken and egg. Public versus Albany versus the elected officials. So let me start with the public, because elected officials should be responsive to the public. So I'm just going to pretend that is the case now. Where is public sentiment when it comes to things like college behind bars, access to education behind bars, reducing sentences, streamlining parole, diversionary programs and things like that? Is the public in line with the recommendations in the report, or is bringing the public along going to be part of the process here?
That's a really, really good question. And yes, we'll stipulate that elected officials respond to public pressure.
Correct.
So it depends on our recommendations, but I think there's a broad and growing bipartisan movement for criminal justice reform that we've seen over the last decade or so. We've seen it at the federal level in the form of the First Step Act that was passed under the Trump administration, which we could have a whole other discussion about. But that sort of movement began at the states, and it still exists in New York State too. Reforms, like I mentioned, like sealing and expungement, there's a very large bipartisan consensus in support of these reforms. There was an article in The Economist a couple of years ago that found support was upwards of the 60% or so. And this is not the sort of thing where only progressive, quote, blue states are pursuing these. If we were to implement clean slate laws, it would find itself in the company of Utah, not typically thought to be a blue state, Pennsylvania, arguably a purple state, and New Jersey. So these are reforms that are bipartisan and that have been adopted in states that in states of all political stripes, basically. I think there's been some concern that New York just passed a major criminal justice reform last year, bail reform, which is hugely important. I think there was some concern that that's enough. Like the population had sort of believed that criminal justice reform was done. That's not what we're seeing, actually. I think the election results show that legislators were given a mandate for continued work on criminal justice reform. And some of these policies we propose are exactly the right option. There's also growing support for prison education too. I should mention, I participated in a conference with the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative-leaning think tank on prison education. It's an interesting coalition.
Well, I mean, part of that, it is interesting, especially with criminal justice reform at the federal level, having, I think it's Senator Cory Booker and Senator Rand Paul who are joining together, but Senator Booker coming at it from the left perspective of compassion and equity, and Senator Paul coming at it from the point of view of this is expensive. It's really expensive. Okay, so now let's talk about elected officials in New York State, because as we have seen, and again, since I'm in Washington, I'm focused on the national level, but there are a whole host of issues that enjoy wildly popular support, and yet no movement when it comes to the elected officials doing anything about it. So when it comes to the reforms you're proposing, in New York State, is there the political will? Are there state legislators who are foursquare behind what you want to do and will make these go from proposals to reality?
Yeah, that's the question, I think, over the next several months. There are definitely champions for each of the proposals we've identified. Clean Slate has a number of people behind it, as does the Less is More Act. Sort of the big hurdle is whether this can be accomplished early in the state session during the budgeting process, or whether we'll have to wait until after the budget to be accomplished in the post-budget session, or at all. What we're pushing for is that we think it can and should be included in the budget. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, it's the best and most important way to get something passed, the way the budgeting process works in New York State. And number two, there's a strong argument that a reform like the Less is More Act will have immediate cost implications for the state, saving on correctional expenses in the short and long term, and benefiting state communities. So I think there's an argument for that, but the momentum I'm seeing is that there really should be interest in taking up proposals like this, even if we can't get them done in the short term before the budget is finished, in the months after the budget is finished. I think there really is some interest in Albany for it. There will, of course, be compromises. There will, of course, be some work to improve legislative text and draw it up. But I think there is momentum for many of the changes we identified.
Among the other, so we've walked through all the policy proposals and the implications. But one thing that also comes out in your report and then the data that you present is that there are wild racial disparities when it comes to who is involved in the criminal justice system, but especially once people come out of prison, the formerly incarcerated, the economic indicators and everything for them is disproportionate to where they are in terms of the overall population. Why are there, and this is going to sound very naive, but it's a leading question, why are there these racial disparities, and what can be done to stop talking about them and actually start moving the needle to shrink those disparities?
Yeah, that's a hugely important question, and I think very revelatory. So if you look at the history of not just the United States, but also New York State, there's a history of policies that were enacted during the, quote, war on drugs, and that had a racially disparate impact. That was especially true in New York State. There's a package of laws called the Rockefeller drug laws that even people who committed relatively low-level drug offenses exposed them to extremely long prison terms, in some cases life imprisonment. So those laws were ultimately repealed sort of in steps, and 2007, I think, is when it started, and 2009 was when the repeal effort ended in earnest. But by that point, it had been decades on the books, and thousands of people had passed through the courts of New York State and been exposed to those penalties. And we actually saw, as recently as within the last 2 decades, I'm blanking on the exact percentage. I think it was in the 80s or 90s% of people entering New York State prison for drug offenses were Black or Latino. So you can see that these laws had a hugely disproportionate impact on people of color. They were also, enforced in that way. We've been talking about stop and frisk in New York City for a long time. And that I think was a huge contributor as well. And we've seen stop and frisk taper off. We've seen the Rockefeller drug law repeal happen. We've seen crime remain rather low in city and state. But the legacy of those laws is still with us. And that's sort of what our report shows. And that's why we need policies that address the long-term impact of conviction and imprisonment.
And so when the report's released and everyone's had a chance to read it, and by everyone, I mean state lawmakers and those and advocates, what message from this report do you think will resonate with decision makers?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think the key message I want people to walk away from is that mass incarceration is first and foremost a moral problem. It's a racial justice issue. It's an economic justice issue. But anything as big as mass incarceration can't help but also be a fiscal and an economic issue. These are, the economic well-being of people who pass through the criminal justice system, the economic well-being of children whose fathers and mothers are impacted by the criminal justice system. So I want people to come away realizing that when we talk about something like criminal justice reform, we're also talking about the short and long-term health and well-being of the New York State economy, of the economies of communities across the state, of everyone who lives in the state, really. I want people to understand this issue as one that impacts them, their communities, their homes, their families as well.
And now that we have a change in presidential administration, is there any role that you can see the Biden administration playing, or the Biden Department of Justice, the new Attorney General, once we have one, what role they can play in helping you achieve the goals that are in the report?
Yes, the short answer is yes. One thing that's especially urgent is if you look at the problems that Albany lawmakers are confronting, they're talking about a huge state budget deficit. Some of that can be mitigated by support from Washington. So to the extent discussions about the budget shortfall stand in the way of criminal justice reform, and for the reasons we talked about, I don't believe it necessarily should, federal support can potentially change the calculus. So it becomes really important. The other thing is, I think federal leadership really matters. When the First Step Act was passed, we saw states adopt similar sort of reforms. We saw states drawing up acts that they called their own, quote, First Step Acts, that were designed to provide relief from state mandatory minimums. So the federal model really matters. So it's something that I think is important to remember is, we saw the federal government, or we saw Congress pass the First Step Act, and we saw President Trump sign it, and it helped a lot of people, especially people serving long drug sentences. We still haven't seen a Second Step Act. We haven't heard really much conversation about what a second step would look like. If we were able to build that momentum in DC again to start talking about, what's the next step in federal criminal justice reform, what would that look like? I think it would sort of build support for similar reforms at the state level. That dynamic works both ways, though. Mm-hmm. So the state, and if a state as important as New York can accomplish a major, robust criminal justice reform package, that can send the signal that there's real interest in this in a very diverse state like New York. Like New York State is by no means just New York City. People of all political opinions live in New York State. And if a state as big and as diverse as New York can enact criminal justice reform, hopefully it'll send the signal back to DC that the country as a whole should as well.
And then in terms of, so there's policy things that Washington can do, but I'm also curious from your perspective, what does it mean in terms of, what role does rhetoric play coming from Washington, the way Washington, and in particular, the way this is talked about from the Oval Office? What role does that play in fostering momentum for what you're trying to do?
It's very important, I think. I think there are real social problems that the criminal justice system interacts with. Crime, violence, policing, etc. And there are real serious policies to grapple with those solutions. Like there are any number of novel ways to address urban violence. I know a number of very smart researchers working on that issue. But if you have rhetoric from national leaders, for lack of a better word, fear-mongering about crime, fear-mongering about the impacts of criminal justice reform policies, that naturally makes it that much more of an uphill battle for anyone to attempt passing criminal justice reform measures. I think what we've seen, especially since this past summer, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, we've seen a real passionate movement for criminal justice reform. To have an administration that echoes to a degree that interest, I think can send a message that it's safe for states to do the same thing. They're not stepping on a limb. Instead, they're taking part in a national movement. And that's a huge sea change from some of the more inflammatory rhetoric that we've unfortunately seen at all levels of government. I think that the way we talk about criminal justice reform as a key to a fairer world and a key to a safer one as well is really, really significant.
And we'll see once there is an attorney general confirmed by the Senate here in Washington, we'll see how the rhetoric changes going forward. Ames Grawert, thank you very much for this conversation. You, Cameron Kimball, and Jackie Fielding are the authors of the report, Poverty and Mass Incarceration in New York, an Agenda for Change. Thank you very much for walking us through what's in this important report.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.